Okay, let's jump in. We've got quite a collection of sources here today, all digging into, well, something fundamental, the future of food, specifically alternative proteins.
That's right. And it's a really wide net these sources cast, from how people ate centuries ago, right up to bleeding edge lab tech.
So we're seeing the environmental side, the ethics, health angles, even culture. It's all in the mix.
Absolutely. And our goal here in this deep dive is to kind of unpack all that, pull out the key threads, and help you make sense of why this whole shift in protein matters to you.
Yeah, we'll hit the obvious stuff like plant-based burgers you see everywhere now,
Mm.
but also maybe some connections you wouldn't expect, like how your mouth, weirdly enough, fits into this whole global food picture.
It really does all connect. Global sustainability goals meeting very personal choices on your plate.
Okay, so let's set the stage. The sources really hammer home that our traditional way of producing meat, well, it's facing some pretty serious challenges. What's the headline there?
Land use is probably the biggest, most striking one. Think about all the farmland worldwide. These sources say over 3/4 of it, 75% plus, goes to livestock.
Wow.
Yeah. And that's even though meat and dairy give us a much smaller slice of our actual calories and protein globally.
Just the ratio itself, 3/4 of the land,
Hmm.
that tells you a lot about the efficiency, right? Or maybe lack of it.
It does. And that massive footprint has real environmental costs. We're
Yeah.
talking pollution, fossil fuels for farming, methane from the animals themselves, pl- land getting degraded, huge amounts of water needed, and often clearing forests just to make more room for grazing.
And the sources suggest this isn't getting better on its own with population growth and like more demand for processed foods.
Exactly. It puts even more strain on things, more competition for land, for water, energy,
Wow.
all those resources.
Right, there's the economic side too. Lots of jobs involved.
True. The sources acknowledge that. But they also point out it comes with that heavy environmental price tag.
Mm.
And then there are the ethical questions raised about conditions in, large-scale industrial farming.
Though they do add some nuance there about less intensive practices.
Yes, they mention things like Amish farming, suggesting not all traditional methods are the same in terms of impact or animal welfare.
Okay, so those pressures kind of create the why for exploring alternatives. Which brings us neatly to the first big one, plant-based foods. The growth there has been huge.
Oh, absolutely surging. You see it driven by health concerns, meat prices going up, just general trends towards vegetarianism, people wanting to cut back on red meat.
But it's not totally new, is it? I mean, the sources mention things like tofu.
Right, tofu, tempeh staples in Asia for centuries.
Mm-hmm.
The Western development of meat analogs, that really kicked off more in the 1960s. Started with things like dry TVP, textured vegetable protein.
Ah, yes, TVP. I remember that. Sort of crumbly.
It could be, yeah. Usually soy or wheat gluten-based, used for texture mostly, in burgers, sauces, stews, that kind of thing.
Okay.
Later on, they started using shredded versions or mycoprotein that's fungus-based, trying to get a more fibrous, meat-like texture.
Right.
But the real leap, the sources point out, was in the 1990s with high moisture extrusion. That technology let them create something with a much better structure and moisture, more like meat, all in one go.
Ah, okay, so that explains the jump to the kind of plant-based products we see now, the ones really trying to mimic the whole experience.
Exactly. Modern stuff is all about hitting consumer preferences, better taste, shape, flavor, plus meeting demands for labels like vegan, organic, gluten-free, you name it.
Mm-hmm.
And there's also this potential, highlighted in the sources, for these alternatives to help meet protein needs in developing countries, where traditional meat might be less accessible or affordable.
Beyond just being a meat substitute, there's a lot of talk about health benefits. What do the sources say on that front?
The evidence summary is pretty compelling. Whole food, plant-based diets generally come out higher in a lot of good stuff. Calcium, magnesium, potassium, iron, vitamins A, C, D, E, choline, fiber.
Okay.
And at the same time, lower in things we often get too much of, like added sugars, saturated fat, sodium.
So more of the good, less of the less good. Makes sense.
That's basically the picture.
Yeah.
And there are specific studies cited, like BROAD and Look Ahead, showing they can be really effective for weight loss.
Participants saw greater drops in BMI and weight compared to control groups.
Weight management is definitely a big driver for people looking at diet changes.
For sure. And for heart health, the benefits listed are quite significant. Lower cholesterol, better blood sugar control, lower BMI, less inflammation, lower blood pressure.
Wow.
And this is linked directly back to eating less saturated fat and cholesterol, but more fiber and those beneficial phytonutrients from plants. They even mention lower risk of dying from cardiovascular disease.
That's pretty powerful stuff. What about other conditions, like kidney disease or autoimmune issues? Yeah, for chronic kidney disease, the sources note improved kidney function and lower risk compared to diets heavy in animal protein.
Oh,
For autoimmune conditions, there's discussion around reducing inflammation.
okay.
Some studies looked at vegan or gluten-free vegan diets for rheumatoid arthritis. They found patients reported feeling better improvements in symptoms. Though, it's noted that these subjective reports were sometimes stronger than the changes seen in objective lab tests or physical measures.
That's interesting, this subjective versus objective difference. What does that really mean for someone listening? Should they be skeptical?
Not necessarily skeptical, but it suggests the experience for the person might improve noticeably, even if standard tests don't always show a huge shift. Or perhaps the effects vary more person to person on those objective markers. It's an area still being researched, but patient-reported improvement is still really valuable.
Good point. Okay, so lots of potential upsides on health. Are there any catches, things you really need to watch out for nutritionally if you go fully plant-based?
Yes, absolutely. The sources are very clear. Vitamin B12 is crucial. It's not really found reliably in plant foods, so you need fortified foods or a supplement. That's non-negotiable.
Right, B12. Got it.
Vitamin D is another one, especially if you don't get much sun. And iodine, think sea vegetables or just using iodized salt. Those are the key ones to be mindful of.
Good practical advice. And economically, this isn't just niche anymore, is it?
Definitely not.
Yeah.
Sales are booming in places like the UK, creating jobs, investment. There's even a claim mentioned that vegetarianism is good for the economy overall.
And socially. Any interesting points there?
Just a couple of quick mentions. One about how sometimes vegetarianism gets seen as a phase, and another kind of thought-provoking point about a potential link between very restrictive eating patterns and maybe feeling social isolated. Food is so social, isn't it?
It really is. Okay, let's switch gears. Alternative number 2, edible insects. Still a bit of a hurdle for some people, I imagine.
It can be, yeah. But the history here is fascinating. Humans have eaten insects for literally thousands of years. The sources mention it was common in ancient Rome.
Rome, seriously?
Yeah. Sometimes a delicacy, sometimes just food for the poor. Pliny the Elder, the famous Roman naturalist, even wrote about it.
Pliny the Elder writing about eating insects.
Oh.
Wow. Okay.
It takes it way back. Now, it didn't really catch on in medieval Europe, but insects are still a major food source today in many parts of Africa. Hundreds of species, like caterpillars, termites, grasshoppers.
Huh?
And in Oceania, too, sago grubs, locusts, crickets. So for many cultures, it's ancient and modern, just not so much in the West, traditionally.
So what's the case for bringing them back or introducing them more widely? Sustainability seems key.
That's where they really shine, according to these sources. They need way, way fewer resources than livestock. Crickets, for example, need about 6 times less feed than cattle.
6 times less feed.
Okay, and get this, maybe 2,000 times less water than beef for the same amount of protein.
Whoa. 2,000 times less water. That's The efficiency game is just staggering then.
It is. And they produce far fewer greenhouse gases, less ammonia than livestock. Their feed conversion is incredibly efficient. Crickets can turn feed into body mass really well, up to 44% efficiency.
Wow.
Plus, they can be raised on organic waste like food scraps, which helps with waste management. And you can farm them vertically, even in cities. Takes up much less space.
Right. And less disease risk.
Generally, yes. Less susceptible to the kinds of diseases that hit large livestock operations, meaning less need for antibiotics or growth hormones.
Okay, the environmental argument is incredibly compelling, but that yuck factor for Western consumers, what do the sources say about overcoming that?
Yeah, disgust is a real barrier. Food disgust, general insect disgust. One study even suggested it might get stronger as people get older.
Huh.
Price is another one. If they're expensive, people are less willing to try them. One study found men might be more sensitive to price than women, interestingly. So if the thought makes you hesitate, you're not alone. That's a common reaction documented in the sources, especially here.
Makes sense. Unfamiliar, expensive,
Yeah.
tough sell. What about taste and look?
Sensory stuff matters hugely.
Yeah.
Though results on how much taste influences people are a bit mixed across different studies and regions. But the big one seems to be visibility.
Visibility, you mean actually seeing the insect?
Exactly.
Yeah.
People in Western markets are generally much more open to trying processed insect products like flour mixed into things or protein bars than they are to eating, say, whole roasted crickets.
Right, so hiding it seems key initially. Like cricket flour in a smoothie is easier than crickets on a pizza.
That seems to be the trend the sources point towards for wider acceptance here. Attitudes are often described as ambivalent, like people might think, ew, gross, but also, good for the planet and maybe healthy.
Okay, what about safety? Are they safe to eat?
The sources say standard processing like boiling or roasting works well to kill off any harmful bacteria.
And other challenges, beyond just getting people to eat them.
Well, wild harvesting needs care. Some traditional methods aren't sustainable, and there's a risk of damaging habitats if it's not managed right. Plus, losing indigenous knowledge about sustainable collection is a concern.
And rules and regulations.
That's a big one, especially in developed countries. Lack of clear rules slows down investment and large-scale farming. The idea of novel food regulations is starting to address this, but it's still evolving.
Okay. But economically, there's potential beyond just human food.
Oh yeah, insects are already vital income sources in many developing nations. And huge potential for greening the economy. Using insects like black soldier flies or mealworms for animal feed is a big area. Even potential for things like biodiesel or chitin from insect shells.
Fascinating. So, ancient practice, huge potential, but some significant cultural and regulatory hurdles, especially in some parts of the world. Okay, let's shift to the third alternative. This one feels maybe the most futuristic, cell-cultivated meat.
Right, often called lab-grown meat, though the industry tends to prefer cell-cultivated or cultivated.
Yeah.
And yeah, the basic idea is growing actual animal cells, like livestock stem cells, outside of the animal in a cultivator.
And a big drivers for this, according to the sources?
Two main ones stand out. First, reducing animal suffering. You don't need to raise and slaughter the animal itself. Second, the potential for a much, much smaller environmental footprint. Less land, less water, fewer emissions, less pollution compared to conventional meat.
Okay, seems logical. But where are we actually at with this? Can you buy it? Is it approved?
It's complicated. The FDA in the U.S. has given a green light, a generally recognized as safe, or GRAS determination for at least one company's chicken product. There's a joint plan involving the FDA for safety, the USDA for the meat regulation side, even the EPA for environmental stuff.
So there's a path.
There is a federal path. Okay. But then you're seeing states jump in. Florida, for example, passed a ban. Other states are looking at specific labeling rules, so it's navigating the system, but with some friction and regional pushback. The FDA does keep a list online of companies that have completed safety consultations.
Okay, so regulation is moving, but maybe bumpily. What about actually making this stuff? What are the hurdles to it ending up, in your supermarket?
Cost is still a really big one. A 2021 analysis put the cost somewhere between $17 and $23 a pound. Compare that to maybe $5 a pound for regular ground beef at the time.
Wow, okay. That's a huge difference. So not exactly competing on price yet.
Not even close, at least based on those estimates. Yeah. And there are technical challenges too. Getting the cells to divide quickly enough, efficiently enough at large scale, and preventing contamination. Keeping large batches free from bacteria or viruses is apparently a major hurdle.
Yeah, contamination sounds like a nightmare at scale.
It does. Some sources sound optimistic, saying these are solvable engineering problems that'll get cheaper and better over time. Others are more cautious, suggesting it could take decades to really crack it efficiently.
Right. And what do people think about eating it? Consumers.
Public opinion seems pretty split. One study found people in the UK were generally less keen than people in the US.
Interesting. Any patterns in who's more or less willing?
Yeah, demographics seem to play a role. In that UK study, younger men were more open, while older women, especially those with university education, expressed more concerns. And how you talk about it matters hugely.
How so?
Cultivated definitely goes down better than lab-grown. Emphasizing the benefits like the environmental angle helps acceptance too. Framing is key.
Framing is always key with new tech, isn't it?
Absolutely. And studies actually show people might be willing to pay more, especially with the right framing. One found they'd pay roughly double compared to a regular burger if the cultivated one was pitched as tastes the same and is eco-friendly.
Double, okay.
And get this, another study framed it as the best burger possible, really high quality. People were willing to pay a premium of over 260% compared to a regular burger. Suggests this kind of gold standard bias. If it's positioned as superior, price might be less of an issue for some.
Huh. Marketed as the ultimate luxury burger, maybe. Fascinating psychology.
It is, but there's a really critical health point the sources stress. allergies.
Oh, how so?
Just calling it cultivated beef isn't enough. If you're allergic to regular beef, you'll almost certainly be allergic to cultivated beef made from cow cells. It's the same protein. That needs to be crystal clear for safety.
Absolutely crucial point. Okay, any other health concerns raised beyond allergy?
Similar to worries about some ultra-processed conventional meats, there's potential concern if these cultivated products end up being highly processed themselves, loaded with salt, unhealthy fats, additives, that kind of thing.
Right, depends on the final product and the existing meat industry, just watching from the sidelines.
Doesn't sound like it. The sources mention lobbying efforts from the traditional meat sector as potentially slowing things down, regulatory approvals, market entry for these cultivated products.
Okay, so we've looked at plants, insects, and cells in labs. Three very different approaches. How do we tie this all together? Connect it back to the big picture and, importantly, back to you listening.
Well, I think the key is seeing these aren't just random ideas, right? They're all responses in different ways to those pressures we talked about at the start, the environmental footprint, the ethics, the resource use of traditional meat. They're potential solutions being explored for a more sustainable food system.
Right, it's not just about swapping one ingredient for another, it's part of a bigger potential shift in the whole system.
Exactly. And the sources really stress that this kind of transition isn't simple. It's not just about the protein source. It involves everything: local context, culture, economics, policy, who's accountable. It needs a real systems view.
And our choices as individuals, they do ripple out into those larger systems, don't they?
They absolutely do. And there's one more connection, maybe an unexpected one, that a source brings up, linking all this directly back to your personal health in a really fundamental way: your oral health.
Oral health, my mouth. How does that connect to alternative proteins in the global food system?
Well, the source frames the mouth as the gateway to the whole body. It's literally where food enters, where digestion starts.
Yeah.
It's your primary interface.
Okay. Gateway to the body. Tell me more.
Digestion starts physically with chewing, obviously,
Hmm.
but also chemically with enzymes in your saliva. Your mouth's connected to your breathing passages. And critically, it's a major entry point for germs, for pathogens. So keeping it clean, good oral hygiene, is actually a first line of defense for your overall health.
So the first impact zone for anything we eat, basically.
Precisely. And it goes deeper. Poor oral health isn't just about cavities or gum disease. It's linked in the sources to bigger systemic problems, things like cardiovascular disease, diabetes, maybe even neurodegenerative disorders down the line, often through chronic inflammation starting in the mouth.
Wow, okay. That's a connection I hadn't really made in this.
The sources don't really compare them head-to-head for oral health specifically, but the general principles hold true for any diet. Lots of sugar or refined carbs. Bad for the oral microbiome, increases cavity risk no matter the protein source. Chewing itself stimulates saliva, which is good and protective. So it really highlights that the overall composition of the food, how processed it is, and how well you care for your mouth. That's what's key for this foundational health layer, regardless of whether the protein came from a bean, a bug, or a bioreactor.
That really does bring it home, connects the very personal, the foundational to these huge systemic shifts. In a way I hadn't quite considered. It makes you think differently about what sustainable or ethical even means on your plate, considering all these layers.
It shows how everything is tangled together, doesn't it? The whole food system.
So, quite a journal today in this deep dive. We've gone from the pressures on traditional meat through the plant-based boom and its health aspects into the ancient world of insect eating with its incredible efficiency but cultural challenges, and right to the cutting edge with cultivated meat facing its own technical and acceptance hurdles.
And seeing how shifting our diets isn't straightforward. It's this complex mix of history, culture, technology, rules, money, and just how people feel about stuff.
And woven through it all, how our personal choices connect to those global systems, right down to something as fundamental as our oral health being the starting point for how food impacts our well-being.
It definitely reminds us there's always another layer, another perspective. Looking at food through the lens of oral health, for example, really adds richness to understanding something we do every day.
So the question we leave you with is this. As you think about these different paths for protein and understand that deep link between your food choices and your whole body's health starting right there in your mouth, what does a truly ethical and sustainable plate look like for you? And how might that picture change in the years ahead?